Good morning and welcome to the Foreign Policy Research Institute. This morning we will be talking about the current crisis in the Great Lakes region of Africa between the Democratic Republic of Congo and Rwanda, surrounding the Rwandan-backed M23 rebel activity in eastern DRC, how this is impacting the Great Lakes region, the Central and Southern Africa region, Africa as a whole, and what impact it might have internationally, particularly for U.S. policy. We have with us today two eminent scholars on Africa, Paul Nantulya from the Africa Center at National Defense University, and Bob Wekesa from the Africa Center for the Study of the U.S. In Johannesburg. Before we get into our program, though, I would like to welcome all of you and remind you that these programs by FPRI, while they're free to you, our audience, they're not free to us. And so we encourage you to support FPRI, particularly the Africa program, and consider becoming a member of FPRI to ensure that we can continue to bring you programs like this. We have a Q&A box at the bottom of your screens. So if you have questions anytime during the presentation, please type your question in the Q&A box, not in the chat, so that we don't miss it. And somewhere about the midpoint of our program, we will take your questions and have our panelists try and answer them. And so without further ado, I would like to start with Paul Nantulya from NDU, followed by Bob Wekesa from ACSUS, to give a bit of an introduction to this subject, and then we'll have a little discussion before we go to the audience for questions and answers. Paul, over to you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Ray. I believe this is the 8th or 9th or 10th time that I've been on an FPRI panel. So it's always one of the favorite things of mine to be on a panel like this. And again, a pleasure to be on a panel with my old friend Bob Wekesa. We always find ourselves on panels and conferences. And so again, it's really a privilege, and thank you to the FPRI team for putting these talks together. The M23, the advances that the M23 organization or rebel movement is making in the Democratic Republic of Congo is on a scale that a lot of people did not expect. Just to give a bit of a background, the M23 is a rebel movement that was formed in 2011 or 2012 by officers of the Congolese armed forces that had been integrated into the force under an agreement that was signed on March 23rd, 2009. Under the terms of that agreement, the defunct rebel movement, which is the predecessor of the M23, the CNDP, there was an agreement. It was facilitated by the region between the DRC government and the CNDP that committed itself to addressing a number of issues, but three in particular. One was the integration of the CNDP officers and men into the Congolese military. Two, the two sides agreed that they would find a mechanism to address a very pressing issue in the DRC, which is the nationality and citizenship of Congolese of Rwandan descent. Now, back in 1884 or 1885, a group of gentlemen sitting in Berlin, the infamous Berlin Conference, carved up the African continent into spheres and zones. And that cutting up of the African continent is the basis of the modern African state. So communities were basically cut, these lines, these grids that cut across communities without due consideration of the social and ethnic makeup of these areas. I guess that was not the objective. The objective was to parcel out Africa for the major powers. So in that infamous exercise, in the Great Lakes region, the residents and the subjects of the pre-colonial Rwandan state, which was expanding its borders, these communities found themselves in what was to become Congo or Zaire at independence. So these are the Banyamulenge community, the Banyamasisi community, communities from Rutshuru, and all these other areas, Congolese of Rwandan descent, that used to be part of the ancient Rwanda state that was expanding. You find a similar arrangement in Uganda. There are two provinces in Uganda that used to be part of the pre-colonial Rwandan state. You find a similar situation in Tanzania. So Congo, Tanzania, and Uganda share this predicament of citizens or nationals that were part of the pre-colonial Rwandan state. And at different points in time in these countries, with the exception of Tanzania, which always had a unitary, inclusive policy, in the two countries, Congo and Uganda, the citizenship of this community has always been contested by the regimes in office. They've been manipulated, but at the same time, they've also been instrumentalized and used as a mobilizing tool by rebellion. Because when you find yourself stateless, or when you find that you have a contested nationality and citizenship in a country that is undergoing turmoil, one of the things that you do is every opportunity to join a rebel group, one uses that opportunity as a mechanism of self-preservation. This is what we saw in Uganda with Museveni's National Resistance Army. 1/3 of its manpower came from Ugandan Banyarwanda, Ugandans of Rwandese descent, coupled with Rwandese immigrants and refugees that had been escaping from Rwanda since 1959. These constituted 1/3 or more of the National Resistance Army of President Museveni. And President Kagame is one of those. He's a product of that, right? And many other Rwandans. So Congo is facing a similar situation. So that coming back to that March 2009, March 23, this is where the movement gets its name. This was one of the issues that was meant to be addressed. The third issue that was meant to be addressed was, issues of development, trying to integrate, because, these areas of the Democratic Republic of Congo, the epicenters of which are around 5 cities, Goma, Bukavu, Bunia, Kisangani, Uvira. And these are the same, the rebel columns that we have seen making their push since November last year have made their push around these epicenters. There was that commitment that, development assistance would come to that area and so on. When these soldiers broke away, these former CNDP soldiers broke away, formed the M23, and formed M23 deliberately to draw attention to what they felt were provisions of that agreement that had not been signed. They formed this organization and made a very quick push and seized Goma in 2012 for about a week. But there was a mountain of international pressure against the M23, against Rwanda. And at the same time, there was a very determined push by the Southern African forces that at that time were part of the Force Intervention Brigade that pushed the M23 out, effectively defeated it, right? And in fact, some of the individuals, some of the commanders of the M23, when they ended up in Rwanda, One of them actually presented himself at the U.S. Embassy, and the U.S. Embassy promptly transferred him to The Hague, right? This is Jean Bosco Ntaganda, who, by the way, was part of what I talked about with the Uganda and so on, was actually part of that whole process. So again, this situation of the nationality and so on. So the movement was effectively M23 was defunct. A cohort ended up in Rwanda. They were disarmed and cantoned, and some of them were given up. Some of them are still under house arrest, by the way, in Rwanda. And then you had another cohort, a bigger cohort that ended up in Uganda. They were disarmed and they were confined to a military barracks under the watch of the Uganda People's Defense Forces in Western Uganda, the Bihanga military barracks. Now, at some point, M23 almost kind of disappeared from the narrative of these more than 120 rebel movements that are active in the Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo until 2022, when it resurfaced. But this time it resurfaced stronger, bigger, more militarily capable. The kind of kit that it is demonstrating, the kind of armaments that it is demonstrating, very, very different picture from 2012. So they have made a lightning push. And that push, because all these rebellions in the DRC always begin from the east. But if one looks at the first Congo War, 1996, 1998, and then the second Congo War from 1998, if one actually looks at the rate of movement along those cities that I've just explained, those 5 cities, the M23 has moved at a much faster pace, right? And it is quite clear that it did not attack as one prong. It attacked as 5 or 6 strike forces into each of these different different areas. So it's much better organized, and there are certain things that the M23 is doing now that it didn't do back in 2012. One of those is absorbing defeated Congolese soldiers and police. This is something that it didn't do before. The other is it has now expanded beyond just the issue of the Banyamulenge. It is part of a broader alliance, the Congo River Alliance, that is headed by somebody from the west of the country. His name is Cornel Nanga, who was twice the president of the Independent Electoral Commission of the DRC. And he has made, he's articulating a broader national objective, broader national vision that goes beyond Eastern DRC and goes beyond these communities that I've just described, around which the M23 and other movements before it have articulated. So that's the second major difference. The third major difference is that the movement seems to be less amenable to international pressure. Because back in 2012, there was a lot of pressure, United States, United Kingdom, European Union, and so on. And a lot of Congolese observers agree that diplomatic pressure contributed tremendously to tamping down that rebellion. This time around, this does not appear to be the case. And indeed, it seems that part of the calculus is because at least from an African perspective, the international community is experiencing tremendous change as a result of political changes and so on. And then Europe is really focused on what's happening in Russia, what's happening with Ukraine, what that might look like, and so on. So there's very little appetite, certainly from an African perspective, for international intervention, and international intervention of the kind that we saw back in 2012. That may well have been part of the calculus of the M23, because the rate at which they're moving is pretty alarming. There are 2 big elephants in the room. The first big elephant in the room is Rwanda, because Rwanda has been implicated in numerous United Nations investigations, numerous reports by the European Union, as being as providing diplomatic as well as military support for the M23. This would fit into a pattern that we saw in the First and the Second Congo War, where the most potent Congolese rebellions are those that were backed by Rwanda. The Rwandese narrative is that the Congolese government has put together an array of forces that are fighting alongside it. And included in that array of forces are members of the FDLR. The FDLR is a rebel outfit that is one of these 120 rebellions that are in the Democratic Republic of Congo in the eastern part, that are remnants of the forces that were implicated in the genocide against the Tutsi in Rwanda, in which 1 million Tutsi, as well as Hutu who were either married to Tutsi or who had some affiliation with Tutsi and so on, lost their lives, were massacred. And then when the Kagame's rebels, which were backed heavily by Uganda, when they defeated the genocidal forces, a bulk of these forces then escaped into the Democratic Republic of Congo, where they reorganized and began launching attacks into Rwandan territory. The Rwandans have complained that these groups have not been neutralized, despite the fact that at least on 2 occasions, if my memory serves me right, the Rwandans and the DRC have found ways in which both sides have conducted joint operations against the FDLR, aimed at neutralizing the FDLR, in order to remove that reason as to why, Rwanda has used that to justify its interventions in the Democratic Republic of Congo. So Rwanda is the big elephant in the room. President Kagame was on a CNN interview, and he was asked plainly whether his military is backing the M23, and he said he didn't know. He didn't know that, many things can happen, and, he gave that example. And it sounded a bit odd. You could actually even see the journalist, this journalist was kind of like taken aback. But I think Kagame was recalling a very similar incident when the RPF, which was essentially consolidated in Uganda, which then launched a push into Rwanda, that was effectively a third of the Ugandan army at the time, launched a push into Rwanda. Museveni was out of the country when that happened. And he was asked, I think it was a BBC or it might have been a CNN interview. And the interviewer asked him, President Museveni, are you aware that there are credible reports that suggest that your military is actually backing 100% the RPF and might actually be involved? He gave the same answer. He said, I don't know. But if it is indeed the case, then that would be a situation of treachery, because these boys are part of the Ugandan army. So you see the complexity of this. So I think that's what Kagame was probably thinking about when he gave that answer. Nevertheless, Rwanda, big elephant in the room, but consistently denies the accusations and refutes the evidence. Uganda is the other big elephant in the room, because Uganda and Rwanda were staunch allies because of their history, were staunch allies. Who became rivals and actually even fought against each other at some point in the DRC, and then began backing separate rebellions. And indeed, the narrative back in 2012, when this M23 then suddenly emerged, the narrative was, because the larger cohort of the M23 ended up in Uganda, and another cohort of the defeated M23 ended up in Rwanda, there was a risk. Indeed, some analysts actually said and concluded that now you have 2 chunks of the M23 that are backed by Uganda and Rwanda, and which it will become a repeat of what happened in the past. But that does not seem to be the case. And there have been numerous media interviews in which senior Ugandan commanders and generals and so on have appeared in the Ugandan press and have have been openly and boldly sympathetic to the M23, to the M23's, the issues that the M23 is putting on the table, and even by extension, Rwanda. We haven't seen that before. And Uganda, about a week ago, deployed into Bunia, seized Bunia, and eyebrows were raised when an M23 column began moving north of Goma in the direction of Lubero, which is not far from Bunia. So that raised a lot of speculation that the two sides might actually have decided that this time around, either Uganda would not stand in Rwanda's way, or Uganda would tolerate Rwanda's moves, or that the two sides would effectively be coordinating. Part of that comes from the fact that in the months leading up to the seizure of Goma, there were a number of high-level exchanges between the top brass of the Ugandan military and their Rwandese counterparts in Kigali and Kampala. And so, again, Uganda becomes the big elephant in the room, although Uganda has said that its deployment is does not violate prior agreements with the Congolese military, because Uganda has been in the Democratic Republic of Congo pursuing the Allied Democratic Forces, which is one of those rebel groups that is active in there. And nevertheless, Museveni clarified that the UPDF was not in Congo to fight the M23, and that the Congolese government should reach out directly to the M23 and engage in discussions with them. This, of course, did not go down well in Kinshasa. It has not gone down well in Kinshasa at all. And so when we saw the burning of a number of diplomatic missions in Kinshasa, Uganda was one of those missions that was set alight, as well as Rwanda. Again, just showing the public sentiment in the DRC that is very, very entrenched. The public sentiment towards these two countries, and also towards the international community, which within some sections of the Congolese community believe that the international community have been in cahoots with Uganda and Rwanda in the First Congo War, the Second Congo War, and so on. So that remains latent in the DRC, and we're going to continue to see a lot more of it as the rebellion continues. So I think I'll stop there. I just really wanted to give a background and a current synopsis of what's going on in the country.
Great, thank you. Now, Bob, over to you.
Thank you, Ambassador Ray, and thanks to my colleague, Paul. I think you laid out a very solid context and background to this. I will try to intervene at this point from the point of view of just building on what Paul has said, the key issues and the key actors, and of course, try not to regurgitate what Paul has said, so that we touch on other matters in this very large scale Great Lakes region conflict. And I think my starting point would be to just consider the whole point of the regionalization of the crisis. I think, as Paul has referenced, essentially the big actors here are Rwanda and Uganda, and of course DRC itself. And of course the key actor is the M23 rebel force. But alongside this have come also other actors with their own interests. And in fact, when you talk of interests, one has to start with the point that accusations have been leveled at Rwanda and President Paul Kagame on at least two fronts, if not more. I think three that I can think of. One, that courtesy of the concern about the FDLR, which is essentially the rebel Hutu community-dominated rebel group out of the unfinished 1994 genocide, is such a problem to Rwanda that Rwanda must enter the fray to try to pacify them or to try to remove them so that Rwanda is at ease with itself. And so that's one major factor. But along those, even as that is a major factor, there have been accusations leveled at Paul Kagame for essentially territorial seizure, for an attempt by Rwanda to actually expand its boundaries, and that some of the analysts are actually saying that an Eastern DRC that is in a mess is good for Rwanda, because then Rwanda can actually have some quasi-claim on a very large territory. In fact, the North and South Kivus are far bigger than Rwanda itself, Rwanda the country. And if you consider the fact that there's possibility of the Rwandan, backing of M23, leading to the rebels to go all the way to the border with Zambia, the areas of Lubumbashi, then that would be, far bigger than Rwanda and Burundi combined. And that the idea has been that Rwanda feels quite economically well advanced now, and it feels it's in a position to expand its territory. If not, then at least it will continue holding on to this territory by other means, by having a rebel movement that it backs, that it works with. Now, why would Rwanda want to seize territory in the Eastern DRC if that claim is indeed to be sustained? Just apart from geographical expansion, so that tiny Rwanda can actually start looking at what it ought to have been before the partition of that country, is the fact that this is a region that is mineral resource rich. That part of Eastern DRC is one of the leading suppliers of coltan, of copper, of lithium, the so-called critical minerals that have become very important in our current times in terms of new, digital technologies, electric vehicles, they're used in mobile telephony, in computers, in aviation, and so forth. In fact, eyebrows have been raised over the last couple of months to the fact that Rwanda does not have these resources, but it has become one of the major exporters. Rwanda, in fact, entered into partnership with the European Union a couple of months back to ensure that there's a free flow of these minerals from the Eastern DRC. It has also been claimed that the M23, one of the things that they have done where they have seized territory is actually to manage the minerals, to collect taxes from some of the miners or mining companies and mining entities, to control some form of artisanal mining and so forth. So apart from the political geographical expansion, it is thought that Rwanda and Paul Kagame are also very much interested on the economic front in terms of benefiting from the export of these minerals. So related to all these factors is the idea that the M23 now, in fact, they have said it openly, that they will like regime change in the DRC itself. Of course, this is a large country. But as Paul mentioned in the first and second Congo wars, the fighters either entered Kinshasa or came close to doing that. And so the idea is that they will be emboldened enough to not only control Eastern DRC and southern and northern parts, as it were, but go all the way to Kinshasa and effect a regime change. So these are really some of the big issues, and evidence to some of these have been UN reports that kind of indicate that indeed the power, the capacity to fight by the M23 is down to supply of sophisticated arms, very high levels of training and discipline, lots of good intelligence so that they can pacify regions they enter into, and that this cannot happen for just a ragtag army or force. This must be a benefit they are deriving from a state. And this then guys are saying it can't be anybody else other than Rwanda. And in fact, if you listen, and I'm happy Paul referenced President Paul Kagame's interview with the CNN, if you just look at the many videos that have come out where Paul Kagame is explaining situations, and you do a discourse analysis, you'll see very many hints he drops about essentially indicating that this is RDF, Rwanda Defense Forces, integrating with M23 in the Eastern DRC. And I think one of the examples I can give is when President Cyril Ramaphosa of South Africa, which is another major actor here, perhaps not as direct as Rwanda, DRC, and Uganda, but it's of course, South Africa has ambitions of being the continental superpower, even more so in the SADC region. But when President Cyril Ramaphosa reacted to the death of about slightly over 20 South African forces, saying that Rwanda was involved and so forth, President Paul Kagame answered in a manner that was very indicative of involvement. Because President Ramaphosa said, if there were any further attacks on the Southern African mission in DRC, which it's called, it will be considered an act of war. And President Paul Kagame said, if South Africa attempts to enter the fray, it will be dealt with on the same terms, meaning that they will now come to blows proper, South Africa and Rwanda, as it were. And of course, now I've already went into one of the major then actors there, at least on the diplomatic front, which is the Southern African Development Community. This then brings in another actor as well. This is one regional bloc where DRC belongs. Rwanda does not belong there, but Rwanda belongs to the East African Community. The East African Community had put together a force in late 2022. It was active in trying to serve as some kind of peace-building force in 2023. But I think the East African force, of course, East African force then comprises the militaries of Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania, and Burundi, to some extent, South Sudan. But at some point then, they were ejected from Eastern DRC by President Felix Tshisekedi because he thought they were not being effective and that they were actually leaning on the side of Paul Kagame. Many analysts, in fact, think the East African community, whose headquarters is in Arusha, of course, is leaning more towards the Kagame and therefore, by extension, the M23 position. For instance, up to this point in time, the Kenyan ambassador to DRC has not been allowed to deliver his credentials. I think, Ambassador Ray, you understand this, that if you're not accepted by the receiving country, then it's fait accompli. You can't even land. So I think at that point, then, DRC had actually joined the East African community not long ago. With that, I think, as one of its strategies, to use the bigger regional bloc to kind of contain the situation in the Eastern DRC. So with their departure in everything but name from the East African community, they have leaned more on the SADC end of things. But fortunately, at least if there's any ray of hope here, it is that only a few days ago, I think on February 8th, the East African community and the SADC, Southern African Development Community leaders met and agreed to revive the negotiations, actually called for ceasefire, which I doubt is going to be respected. They appointed Presidents Olusegun Obasanjo of Nigeria, Uhuru Kenyatta of Kenya, and Haile Mariam, the last Haile Mariam of former Prime Minister of Ethiopia, to lead the peace process. They have given themselves 30 days to come up with workable solutions. So I think I'll just conclude. There are many other actors here and issues, but I'll just conclude by saying the international community has also now weighed in. We know the position of the UN. The UN position is closer to that of the DRC than Rwanda. And I think we've seen that in the resolutions made in the UN Security Council and other forums of that nature. But in quick succession over the last couple of days, we've seen countries such as Britain, Belgium, Netherlands, actually issuing sanctions, withdrawing aid from Rwanda unless it kind of gets back into line. So I think I'll conclude this by just saying, even though Rwanda is very determined perhaps to support the M23, it is actually facing quite a bit of isolation if you look at things from the international community. I'm sure there will be other issues to discuss, but let me stop here for now. Thank you.
Well, thank you both. Before we go to questions from the audience, I have a couple of my own, starting with sort of a military observation. I've been watching, we don't get very much news here in the US about the situation, but I have a news feed streaming service that does present Africa news and news from Europe and Canada. And my observation of the filming of the M23 rebels as they've gone into like Bukavu and Goma is that you're not, as you said, Paul, both of you, that you're not looking at a ragtag force of guerrillas. I mean, this is a sophisticated, well-organized military force, well-equipped, and this is not something that could be done in a matter of a few weeks. What I saw on my TV screen was evidence of probably years of training and preparation. How is that figuring into the SADC EAC approach to this? Because what I see is a clear indication that Rwanda has probably spent this time from 2009 until this recent crisis broke out of preparing these forces to go back into DRC. Paul, you want to?
Yes, certainly during from a purely military perspective, it's clear that the period of the M23's hibernation was a period of intense training, intense capacity building, intense armament, intense preparation. There's no question about that. There was a South African general who was making a comment about the M23. He was giving a military analysis of the M23, and he said, "Look, these are not rebels." And then he referred to himself, because a lot of these non-white South African generals are from the former ANC army, the army that fought against the apartheid government. And they were rebels. And he said, "Look, I've been a rebel. I've been a rebel in the ANC, and I've been in a rebel army, and I know what a rebel army is when I see it. The M23 is not a rebel army and cannot be described as such." So I think that's one point of view. The other one is yes, it is it can also be described as a the terminology that we like to use is proxy force. But this is a standing army. It's a standing army. I mean, you see the kit, you see the movement, you see the swagger, you see the communications. It's a regular standing army. And some analysts have said that this might actually be the sharp sword of Rwandese foreign policy in the region, and probably to a lesser extent Uganda. But this is by all intents and purposes, this is a very capable regular force. I mean, there was a journalist, a very brave journalist, who went out to the to Sake and Goma, because the Southern African force, the Sami DRC force, is holed up in Goma and Sake in their bases. This was after the firefight that Bob explained, and so they put up their white flags. They negotiated a ceasefire, but those cantonments of the SADC forces are being kept under guard, 24-hour guard by the M23. And there was a journalist who went in there and was able to get the documents that are going back and forth between the confined SADC forces and the M23 in terms of, a force that has to go out to get rations, to get water, to get contractors who come in to do the ablutions, the sanitation. You know, these are all military thing, this is all military stuff that goes on. But when you look at the documentation that is going from the Sami DRC to the M23, and the response by the M23 to the Sami DRC saying, okay, this is how the movement is going to be, and we're going to provide, you know, we're going to provide force protection and so on. And these are the areas that, this is a serious, this is a serious army. It's not even in terms of its communications. So that lends further credence to the suggestion that such an army cannot, you know, cannot exist without serious state backing. But what I am very worried about is history repeating itself, because the First and the Second Congo War sucked in 7 African armies. 7 African armies, right? This is often referred to as Africa's First and Second World Wars. There's a very real prospect. In fact, the trend lines are in that direction. The Sami DRC forces are in Congo under a treaty within the Southern African Development Community that compels member states to send military forces to the aid of a member country in two situations. One, if that country has been invaded by a non-member, or 2, if that country is facing a national security threat that is complex and it cannot manage on its own. The Sami DRC forces were sent on the latter legal requirement. And I am arguing that given the tension that exists between South Africa and Rwanda, and also between SADC and Rwanda, and potentially even, you know, because the SADC and the East African community are not seeing eye to eye on this issue. Not seeing eye to eye on this issue. Should the Sami DRC forces then decide that that clause enjoins them to beef up their presence and to take on the M23 directly, then you are in a Second Congo War situation. Because in the Second Congo War, the SADC forces, Zimbabwe, Namibia, and Angola intervened on the side of former President Kabila against the Ugandan and Rwandan assault that took place in the eastern parts of the Democratic Republic of Congo. Absent a serious African diplomatic initiative, that is unfortunately the scenario that we're going to be faced with.
Thank you. That's a chilling prospect. Let's get to questions from our audience. So hopefully we can get all of them for a change. Starting here with one, and Bob, maybe you can take this one, and then Paul, if you have some you want to add, fine. It says your Rwandan ambassador, Mukantabana, points out that there are some 100 militia groups in Eastern DRC, and that the DRC president has not negotiated in good faith. Your comments on this?
No, I think I'll start by, first of all, just touching a bit on the previous question, which links to this actually. I think if you think of strategy from the Rwandese, this question referencing the ambassador, you have to think Rwandan foreign policy, Rwandan diplomatic moves as strategy. And I think I will start from the fact that I think Rwanda feels so very much ill at ease that it is then reaching out to rebel groups, M23 specifically, but also now increasingly co-opting others into the M23 fold. Now, the idea that DRC should negotiate with rebels for a government that is supposedly elected, of course, there have been questions about Tshisekedi's own legitimacy, but he's the holder of state power, and he will want to crush the rebel groups rather than negotiate with them. You can imagine if it was the same situation in, say, Uganda or Rwanda, where there are rebels, and you're asking President Paul Kagame to negotiate with them. I don't think that will even, survive the paper it's written on. So I think the idea that President Felix Tshisekedi should negotiate with rebels, in this case with credible evidence of Rwandan support, is actually the side of the argument that seems to suggest that Rwanda is not operating on some level ground in good faith, as it were. And I think this is what has pushed Rwanda, the DRC and Felix Tshisekedi, to look downwards to the other, bloc that it belongs to, which is SADC. I think that would be the answer.
Well, thank you. And that actually leads very well into this next question. Says, I have seen people compare President Kagame's actions with that of President Putin. How accurate is this comparison? What are the similarities and what are the differences?
Look, I think President Kagame is President Kagame. I don't think comparisons of that kind can be made. Yes, Putin sent his forces ostensibly to protect so-called Russophones or Russia-speaking communities in Ukraine and other parts of the region. Yes, President Kagame has articulated that communities of Rwandan descent who are not Rwandese but Congolese are being persecuted in that country. This is a Ugandan military is also making the same observation. So I guess to that extent, one might say that that there's a Putinistic element of Rwandese foreign policy. But looking beyond that and looking at it from a deeper perspective, I think Kagame is his own man. This is a man who he came to Uganda. He went to Uganda when he was 3 years old, in 1950s with his mother, because there were pogroms against Tutsis. Became a refugee in Uganda, but as you know, Uganda has always had a favorable policy towards refugees. So he went to school, and he actually went to the same school as Yoweri Museveni, although he was in a much lower junior classes. He's very junior to Museveni. And then he joined Museveni's rebellion. In fact, he was among, there's this myth, there's some heroics around the Ugandan move that it was started by 27 men who launched this attack in order to start the Revolutionary War. Kagame was among the 27. And he fought that war, and he is basically a veteran of the Ugandan war. After the movement captured power, Kagame rose through the ranks and actually became head of counterintelligence. By the time Rwandan refugees and Ugandans of Rwandese descent and so on who were in the Ugandan army, when they went across the border to invade, I don't like to use the word invade their country because they were Rwandans and so on. President Kagame was actually here in the US at Fort Leavenworth, attending the General Staff and Command as a Ugandan officer. And then he had to be withdrawn in order to lead, because the original leader of the RPF thrust into Rwanda was killed within 24 hours of that operation. And then he fought prosecuted the war in Rwanda. So here's a man who is a veteran of 2 guerrilla campaigns. And those guerrilla campaigns revolved heavily around the issue of statelessness and contested nationality and citizenship. So that's why this issue becomes extremely important. So yes, to some extent, Kagame might be Putinist, but I think if we understand Kagame the man, the underlying motivations of Kagame, the man is a veteran of 2 wars that revolved more or less around the same issues. And I think he's the only president of that kind on the continent who has actually been in this kind of scenario. He's served in 2 armies, 2 national armies, and so that's Kagame. That's Kagame the man. So I just want to put that context there.
Interesting. Next question here. We've heard talk about the 2 big actors, Rwanda and Uganda. What is the role of multinational cooperation in this conflict? And also, why is it that after Congo took Apple to court, the attacks of M23 doubled in aggression? Bob, that
Sure.
question makes sense to you?
Right, no, certainly. I think I'll start by saying, obviously, multinationals have been the least analyzed aspect of the current conflict. And I think there are colleagues, in fact, here at Wits University who are, looking at this from the point of view of look at the multinationals involved in mining in Eastern DRC and other parts of DRC. These will be Australian companies, Chinese companies, companies from other parts of the world. They haven't really come out openly, or I think research on their involvement hasn't come out. And yet, we hear and learn that M23 has taken control of certain mines, is extracting tax from some of these companies who want to continue with the lucrative business of mining of these highly expensive, highly profitable minerals. And so I think that aspect, of course, usually in these conflicts, international mining companies tend to hedge their bets, tend to work with the person in control. Sometimes they escape scrutiny. But I think that's a research area that we need to focus on, because advertently or inadvertently, they might be aiding the war. And of course, as we mentioned, Rwanda is said to have suddenly become an exporter of these critical minerals. And how is it then, to whom is it exporting to? And with whom is it colluding to get the minerals out of Eastern DRC? Definitely, there's an international trade aspect to this that must involve big players. And these big players remain almost amorphous. I think the other aspect that one has to look at is what I referenced earlier, which is the EU MOU with Uganda to keep the minerals flowing. This will actually suggest that European companies involved in mining might actually be quietly figuring out how to continue being relevant in the current circumstances. And again, I do not have specific names, but it's a very good question that can be researched further. And lastly, one has to consider the fact that Rwanda has done very well in branding itself as a very well-organized country government. And under that auspices, it has developed very good relations, for example, with soccer or football teams, the big players, the European leagues, including Premier League in the UK. Rwanda, in fact, was going to host Formula One sports, which would have been one of the first on the continent. And therefore, this suggests that even beyond direct mineral exports, Rwanda might end up suffering the loss of these international commercial partnerships that it has done very well, better than many African countries, because now there's an increasing call for these companies, for these soccer teams and sports organizations, and in fact, organizations such as NBA, which is a big American brand, to actually not deal with Rwanda and Kagame on the basis of this. So that might be a loss. Thank you.
Great. Okay, next question here. This is a long one. First of all, thank you to both panelists for an excellent background information. If the new M23 rebellion's goal is now regime change in Kinshasa, do you think this might be a result of the escalating rhetoric between Presidents Kagame and Tshisekedi, and perhaps to a lesser extent Ramaphosa? It seems to me that resuscitated rebellion might have originally been intended to counterbalance Ugandan and/or Burundian military adventures in Eastern Congo as a result of mutual escalation by all players involved. Want to take that one first, or whoever?
Yeah, I think there's, mutual, that escalation. This is why I was saying that an African diplomatic initiative is badly needed at this point to prevent precisely that. That's the scenario that one would want to prevent. I tend to take the optimistic view because the Congolese have a reserve of experience in conflict resolution, in high-level mediation, and in ceasefire talks. Actually, we have seen the Congolese Catholic Bishops Conference engaging in very high-level track 2 diplomacy. They've talked to Tshisekedi and they've talked to presidents of the region. And part of that initiative, actually, the M23 paused before seizing Bukavu for about 2 to 3 days as a result of that effort. So I think that effort needs to be continued and perhaps even integrated in the Nairobi and Luanda processes. Secondly, the Congolese also have a number of initiatives behind them. So they have the Sovereign National Conference of 1992, which actually addressed many of these issues that have caused the war, that caused the First and the Second Congo War and the current rebellion that is taking place, right? These issues were addressed. Unfortunately, Mobutu did not have an interest in implementing them, but I think it's an important learning point. The Sun City process, which I participated in from beginning to end in South Africa, which was modeled after this process that I've just described, also found a framework, right, of rebuilding Congo on a democratic basis, because I think that's the fundamental issue here. Security sector reform and so on, right? Again, that's a Congolese experience. The Lusaka Peace Accord, which removed the 7 armies that were involved in the Congo through South African mediation. And again, I was part of that process as a younger officer, and I saw how effective that could be. I saw how effective it was. And then there was the Pretoria Accord, which brought Rwanda and the DRC together under President Thabo Mbeki's mediation, right? Very effective. That actually created a basis for the two countries to collaborate on security issues. So I think there's a wealth of experience. There's a wealth of experience behind the Congolese, which can be revitalized and used in order to prevent that scenario that all of us can see coming.
Okay, thank you. There are two questions here that are aimed at me. I want to answer them quickly and see if we can get a couple more. One is, we've seen some top Rwandan officials sanctioned by the U.S. What do you think Trump's foreign policy toward the conflict will be? And will Rubio pay a visit to the Congo? And the second question is that we're recording, will this be made available to participants? I'll answer the second one first. The recording will be on YouTube, the FPRI page on YouTube by later today or tomorrow, and it's available to anyone. And on the first question, at this point, it is difficult to say what the U.S. policy toward this conflict will be because there's been so much emphasis on domestic issues that foreign policy other than Gaza and Ukraine really haven't risen to the level of public visibility. I would point out, however, that given the president's current attempts to get an exclusive agreement to get Ukraine's precious minerals, and the fact that that's going to be a good 3 to 5 years before any kind of gain could be seen from that, based on the condition of the mines in Ukraine, that the minerals in Eastern DRC could end up playing a role in developing U.S. policy. But that's something we'll have to wait and see. And as far as the Secretary of State's travels to Congo, I have not seen anything indicating that that's in the immediate future. So at this point, there's really no answer that can be given to that. Okay, now back to questions for our panelists. I read that there are calls for the EU to cancel its trade agreement with Rwanda for critical minerals. Has this occurred? Bob?
No, I don't think that hasn't occurred, but it might. If we look at what individual European countries are doing, it looks like that is something that might be under consideration. I think, as we mentioned, no less than 3 European countries have either paused aid programs. There's very frosty diplomatic relationships with Rwanda. So I believe the statesmen and diplomats in Brussels, when they do meet to consider this particular conflagration, that will be something that they might want to review. And if they reviewed it, I don't see how it would be good for Rwanda. It might be that they move towards saying, we cannot continue engaging on the basis of what we are seeing.
Okay, we have time for one more question that I'd like both of you to give an answer to. What do you believe President Kagame's long game is? We saw after the first Congo War when Rwandan and Ugandan-backed Kabila turned against Rwanda and Uganda, leading to the second Congo War. What's to prevent that from happening again? Bob, you first, and then Paul.
Right. I think to respond to this question, one has to look at what are the motivations for President Paul Kagame, Rwanda, and M23. I think that returns us to the 2 or 3 key calculations there. One is ensuring that Rwanda is not ill at ease because of the rebels that are targeting Rwanda and have been doing so since 1994, 1995, after the genocide there. So this will be a motivation, a key motivation for him to ensure that his country remains safe. I think related to that, an Eastern DRC that is in the hands of M23 is a better option for Rwanda, as long as, in fact, I think we should have said this. The other factor here is that President Felix Tshisekedi and the government in Kinshasa is extremely weak as well. I think we saw that they actually, the DRC army basically folded. They kind of, as we say on the continent, they ran away when the heat became too much. They couldn't sustain a fight. This tells you that the military end of things and therefore the government is weak. In fact, people have gone as far as saying President Felix Tshisekedi, in the context of DRC itself, might be a problem rather than the solution. So on the basis of that, Rwanda's calculations would be, we are at our strongest at this point in time. Let's attempt to march on Kinshasa. What will that cause? I think the likelihood of the third Congo War is loading. From my basic reading, I might be wrong, but I don't think the SADC community, including South Africa, will let M23 and its affiliates march on Kinshasa. Particularly a country like South Africa, which has already suffered casualties here. Its reputation is in line here. And there are conversations here in South Africa that President Cyril Ramaphosa is weak, that the South African army is also weak. They couldn't sustain a fight and so forth. And I think because South Africa is a big voice in the Southern Africa region, they might say, no, look, we can't let this happen. So my reading at this point in time is outside of a diplomatic effort to cease hostilities and at least post things where they are, if not stop the expansion. I think I see a clash, kind of loading, unless, of course, as I've mentioned, diplomatic action kicks in. Yeah.
Paul?
Yes, I think Bob puts it very well. If I try and look into the crystal ball and try and understand the mind of Kagame, the mind of Paul Kagame, there could be any number of long-term objectives. The one is to have a North and South Kivu, these are the Kivus, under an administration in the North and the South. In other words, having a government in Goma, a government in Bukavu, and a government in Uvira, because these are provincial governments that are friendly or sympathetic to Rwandese concerns, which may explain why the M23 is now part of a political coalition, a larger political coalition. I guess that might be the first objective. The second objective could be much larger, which is having a government in Congo itself, in Kinshasa, So not just provincial governments, but then central government in Kinshasa that is friendly to Kigali, that understands Kigali's position and is sympathetic to Kigali's interest, right? So that's where the regime change option comes in, and where the regime change option might be attractive in the mind of Kagame's long-range thinking. But I think we also shouldn't forget the greater issues, one of which is Burundi, because the M23 rebellion are very, very, very close to Bujumbura, about 25 minutes, right? If you go to if they're able to take Uvira, it's just 25 minutes, right? And there are Burundian rebels that have been fighting pitched battles with the Burundian military in South Kivu. And bearing in mind the retreat of the Burundian forces to Bujumbura in order to reinforce their position in South Kivu, one cannot rule out a Kagame goal that also seeks to have a government in Bujumbura that is friendly or that is sympathetic to Rwanda and to Rwanda's interest. Because it seems that Rwanda and Uganda have patched up. So Uganda is no longer a problem in this scenario. Rwanda and Burundi, the relations have been very frosty since 2015. Both sides accuse each other of supporting their respective rebels. So unless that issue is resolved between Burundi and Rwanda diplomatically, it may well be that Kagame may be looking at a larger regional configuration. It's not pie in the sky, because after the first Congo War, there were like-minded governments in Congo, Burundi, Rwanda, and Uganda. And all these governments were led by individuals that had participated in all their respective wars. So that would not be a pie in the sky scenario. Especially since Uganda, it seems like the relationship between the two sides, it seems they've patched things up. So that might be my, but don't take me to court. Don't take me to court if it doesn't work out that way.
I'm sure no one will. No, thank you. That's very interesting, frightening but interesting. Because I mean, if I lived in South Africa or Zambia right now, I would be very nervous. Thank you both for a very enlightening presentation.